Good morning, and I'll speak for all of us. We're really glad to be here and have an opportunity to continue the dialogue. And we're going to start with kind of building off where Rebecca was, where the dialogue going around challenges facing our executives today. And I thought, how do I kick this off? Well, it didn't take long to look at the newspaper or my phone to find examples in the last 2 weeks of major issues that have occurred in companies. And I thought I would just start out with three different examples that I think bring to life the challenges at the C-suite level. And it's not just good enough any longer to deliver financial performance. There are so many other challenges facing executives today. So let's pick three. Let's pick WeWork, community work, right? Everybody knows the WeWork story, high flyer company, community workspace. In the last week, CEO out over his behavior, his transparency, and investor disappointment. IPO permanently delayed, and the biggest investor bought the majority of the company to take control. That's a startup environment, okay? So let's go to an established company environment. Let's look at what's going on at Boeing right now and the continued crisis over the IMAX 337. And when I put my thoughts together today, I was going to raise the fact that they split the CEO and chairman job and took the chairman role away from the CEO. But just yesterday, they took out the head of the commercial division. And so there's another example of an ongoing executive challenge. And then third, let's pick something out of the community, out of the corporate world, and let's look at the NFL. Let's look at the hot seat the NFL is in right now, because one owner tweeted his support for the Hong Kong protest. And that started China to say, NBA. Thank you. I thought it was the NFL. Okay, well, the hot seat's over here now. Trying to defend, support an owner, support free speech, as well as protect an important market. And it didn't even hit some of the things that Rebecca talked about, right? The economic turmoil ahead, the political turmoil ahead, the values, transparency in the Me Too movement. And so I can't think of a time when leaders have faced a broader set of challenges. And so we're going to start the discussion around how do we help leaders, prepare leaders, and help them manage a time of an extraordinary change. And I'm going to turn to Rich first and ask him, through your work with the HR Policy Association, you have contact with many CHROs. What do you see them doing really to help leaders be ready for those kinds of challenges, those crises that come up that are so much different than delivering just the quarterly results?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. Great to be here. I actually have gotten to know the head of HR for WeWork, so certainly don't have intimate knowledge of what's going on, but I have a lot of respect for his capabilities. And if I could just touch a little bit on WeWork there, I think it just is a great indication, great reminder that the culture really does get set at the top. And if you take a look at some of the things that have come out regarding the founder and things like that, I think that is a great reminder that you've got to have kind of that top management, that CEO who has the integrity and thinking about the organization kind of first before their own particular interests. I actually am now, I left McDonald's coming up on about 4 years ago, and I'm now working as a CHRO for a healthcare startup. So it's a coalition, it's actually a cooperative of about 50 large companies trying to think through how they can move forward with the better healthcare set of solutions. And this notion of when you're a startup and how you hire talent that can grow with the organization as it becomes more mature, I think is a really big thing to really think about. And I think having people that are enticed by working for startups with people that have worked in mature organizations, how you bring those two together and match up those kinds of experiences, I think is really important. So we test for openness, we test for versatility, and we really want to make sure that we're just not hiring people who are passionate for a startup, but we believe can continue to grow. And the only thing I would say is don't believe that you're going to be 100% accurate on that one. And when you do find that situation where somebody's not growing with the organization, then I think it's time to think about a possible upgrade. So those are some of the things that come to mind.
Perfect. And Mindy, I'll look to you. That's an internal perspective. Externally, as you work with companies to place C-suite executives at Russell Reynolds, do you see a shift in what they're looking for, the parameters, the assessment in this turbulent time?
Yeah, so I think it's an important question, and just picking up a little bit about where you left off. You know, there was a point in time recently, probably within the last 5+ years ago, where the focus was on some of those really key competencies that you look for in the C-suite. The ability to think strategically, the ability to execute for results and drive growth and all those things. The shift has really now been made to what we call behavioral characteristics and the ability to have leaders that do have high IQ and EQ. Leaders that have the agility to really, what we call at Russell Reynolds, span across different types of situations and have a more dominant behavior in certain situations and the ability to flex in others. So many of those kind of behavioral characteristics are now taking center stage so that the leadership team can, whether it's the leadership team or even all of those underneath it, like the younger generation, can see role models of the appropriate behavior. And to understand that, we do have assessment tools, and it's by and large, I think, a common occurrence now with leadership teams, with the CEOs, with the boards, to institute some form of formal assessment. That includes psychometric testing, it includes 360-degree feedback. You're collecting a fair amount of data now on individuals that are being considered for leadership positions and triangulating that to really understand what you're getting with this individual so that when behaviors show up down the road, you're prepared for it and you know how to manage it successfully, and then the coaching kind of comes with that.
Now, I'll add my own personal perspective sitting on a couple boards. And after having been on a management team for decades, it's interesting to look up above a business a little bit, not be in it day to day. And the conversations I've seen have shifted much less from the skills they have to the character and values they have and the experience they have had in making very gray decisions. And if they haven't had that experience, very often you wonder if they're able to be a CEO, if they really haven't faced, money versus values or standing up on time or, and that has changed the face of the conversation for us in the boardroom around what a future leader looks like. In the examples I raised, all of those leaders have had flameouts, let's describe it, use that term loosely here amongst ourselves, a very technical term, of course. But they have hit a bump and they're either out or over. And think of the cost to not just the organization, but to many of the people in the organization. You talk about the scale down effect down into the trickle down effect into middle management when there's a change at the top. And so I would look to Vicki and say, in your organization, how are you helping new leaders, mitigate that flame out risk? How are you helping them in new territory not make that misstep that causes them to go off the edge?
So it's a continuation of the conversation that we've really just had. It's all around values alignment with our shareholders and the board and the organization, and being very clear about how those values are shown up every day behaviorally. And while you have that good behavioral guideline, it's in addition to that, the constant feedback. So those feedback loops are so important, not only on having someone to help what I call hold up the mirror, so we know how my behavior is landing on others or coming across the organization. It's that constant feedback loop of this is great, and this is where we need to make a little bit of adjustment. And it comes from all levels of the organization as well. It's not just from your leader, it's finding leaders that are open to that type of feedback on a regular basis.
And in looking to you in education, how are you changing your approach to help prepare leaders like this for the future so they are able to traverse first-time situations more successfully? And then I'd open that up, obviously, to anybody on the panel.
So we do a variety of things. We spend an enormous amount of time right now on research around a topic that really sort of synthesizes what we've all talked about, which is judgment. We'd say that at the very top of an organization, the senior leaders are responsible for having excellent judgment. And yet we haven't talked about that. We've talked about decision making, we've talked about a lot of things, but judgment ethically, morally, judgment financially, judgment physically, judgment emotionally, that senior leaders have that sort of judgment. So we're developing a set of tools to help assess that and help people grow and cultivate their judgment. We'd say that judgment is the ultimate flame-out prevention issue. And that when we're selecting people for the top and when we're helping them to grow, we could do little more important than help them cultivate better judgment. We just see in all the examples that you described and in the newspaper every day, in every endeavor, politics and sport, in business of every type, the exercise of extraordinarily poor judgment.
Yeah.
So that's the primary place where we're putting a huge amount of our research and effort right now.
And how do you teach judgment, right? I mean,
Sure. No.
I don't know. I don't know that I have an answer, but you know, and I'll open it up here.
Yeah.
How do you teach that kind of?
Totally legitimate question, because many people, I think, I'm so fond of Carol Dweck and her book Mindset, which we were talking about at our table. And, you know, we've come from a history of thinking that IQ, personality, and certainly judgment, either you have it or you don't.
Yeah.
You were born with it or you don't have it. And that's just not based in science at all. That's a mythology. So you'd learn good judgment the way we'd learn any other sort of thing. We learn it, first of all, by examining and being aware of mindset, and the mindset that drives the kind of behaviors that you mentioned, Mindy, that are so important, and then skill set about deliberate practices, and the deliberate practices of excellent judgment at the top of an organization. And holding people accountable and giving them support. That's what the people in this room do. So many of the superb coaches that we have here are the key ingredient in that. Because when I ask senior executives, how did you learn? I mean, you're a CEO. How did you become so successful? They almost never say, Fred, it's your courses. Yeah. That's what it's not what comes off. They say experiences, and a lot of them were bad experiences. And then if you keep probing, they'll say, and I had someone, coach, who helped me learn from those experiences, who was a sounding board, who helped me think through things, and helped me cultivate better judgment in very difficult situations.
Yeah, I think, just to build on that, Fred, I mean, role models are so important, but I also think testing people in different environments, and back to Rebecca's insight regarding really looking at cross-functional, in some cases in a global organization, cross-geographic. What you're doing by putting people into those situations is you're expanding their level of perspectives that they can bring then to a decision. And, you know, at McDonald's, when I was there 10, 15 years ago, Eric knows this, I mean, there was so much pride in people becoming CEOs solely through the operations track. And I think we began to realize that one functional career path doesn't provide the expanded perspectives in a fast-changing retail environment and actually change the way that we thought about we would develop our leaders, which is encouraging cross-functional and cross-geographic so that you do expand your perspectives, and that will likely improve your judgment.
I have also found looking for those teachable moments that happen small. You know, you don't have to wait till a massive, you know, IMAX 737 crisis to find a teachable moment. I remember as a new HR person, we had a top sales guy who got caught up in behavior that wasn't becoming. And as we started to, work on it, and we figured it out, that this is what happened, here's the consequence, the leader said to me, well, could we wait till after the quarter to address this? Ding, 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 ding. It's like right there, it was a moment to, for me to try not to judge too quickly, but to open up a door of a conversation around the balance between financial results and really living and walking the talk. Before we close this little portion, any reaction to this from out there before I turn it to Rich on succession? Any reactions or comments or please?
That one over here.
So the term hasn't been used yet, but I think you're describing VUCA.
Yeah.
We're operating
Yeah.
in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And so the stakes are higher and the pressure's on, and the conversation's fascinating.
Yeah. Please, Philippe.
You talked about cross-functional. What about cross-industry?
Yeah.
How important that is that? I think it does enhance the perspective and experience.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, actually, when we started reviewing our diversity makeup with the board, we actually expanded the definition to include, in addition to gender and ethnicity, cross-functional backgrounds, cross-geographic, and actually cross-industry. Because we found that they were particularly from consumer products, and even now, as you take a look at some of the things McDonald's is doing with technology, broadening the way that you think about bringing in talent. So you're absolutely right. It's a great point.
Anita.
I can attest to what Rich said about the need for cross-functional perspectives. I was a lawyer working at McDonald's under Rich, and I had to work in a restaurant for 3 weeks. And I gave you a very different perspective. It wasn't pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody who joins McDonald's, whatever level of the company, has to work in the restaurants before they start doing their job. So it's a good way to get humbled.
Yeah. Walk a mile in somebody else's shoes.
I helped start up Saturn Corporation, and it was America's first new car company in 70 years, and was an extraordinary success. There's a longer story about what happened during the bankruptcy, but half of the people had to come from outside General Motors, and a quarter of the people employed had to come from outside of automotive because there was such insularity in the way of thinking. And we had to sell cars. We had to go out, everyone, including the CEO and all the rest of the executives, had to go out and sell cars and work in a service situation for a period of time. Boy, is that an eye-opener, because old-time service was horrific in terms of the way people were treated, and it really was an extraordinary experience.
And did you stick to those guidelines throughout the way? I've seen many times where we set up a slate and we want a diverse candidate that's got da-da-da-da, and then, 5 or 6 months in, you're like, okay, I can't find it, I move on. Did you guys stick to the criteria?
But I can't really comment because my job was to build the company, and I was only there for the birth. And so once we created the first car, I went on to do other things. So I don't know what happened after the first 5 years.
But I was going to comment on that, because as much as we're talking about cross-industry or cross-function, there is such now a focus and a mandate around diverse candidates in general, from an ethnicity perspective or otherwise, that it has now become, instead of a nice to have, and could you please include diversity on your candidate slate or for consideration, internal or external candidate. It's now a mandate, and it must be even a certain amount for any level of the slate that is presented. And what we have heard is that unless that mandate exists, and if there's not metrics associated with it, it's kind of a little bit meaningless in what the result is. And it really speaks for itself when you see it in action.
Yeah, good.
At our table, Philippe was saying that the next CEO of J&J will almost definitely be a woman, because there's such a huge emphasis in correcting this great aberration we have of only 20% of CEOs being female.
Yeah.
Half the population, you do the math, how does that work?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's a great transition to CEO succession.
Yeah. So the good news is boards and investors are getting a lot more savvy about the importance of CEO succession and even C-suite succession. So there's going to be a lot more interest, conversation, and pressure from the boards and investors that companies up their game in this area. So that's the good news for us. I was lucky enough to have a non-exec chair at McDonald's who, every time that we did a talent review with the board, he said, this is the board's number one responsibility. And to be able to have somebody say that at the chairman level just sets the right kind of tone. I think Ram Charan said something like, if you get the CEO selection right, you've done about 80% of your job as a board. Everything else is going to become a lot easier. And having worked for 5 CEOs at McDonald's and worked on 4 CEO successions, I completely understand what he's saying there. When you have the right CEO, things really do kind of work a lot better, particularly at the board level. So we're going to just start out and ask Mindy, what does a good CEO look like these days?
Well, just to pick up on a couple of the comments of setting the stage here. So it is the board's number one responsibility, and it is almost 80%, 90% of the board's, that's their job profile, is to find the right CEO. What is interesting is that although they know that when they step into that role, and CEO succession is a number one priority for the board, it is often not an extraordinarily planful activity for the majority of companies. Now, we have seen that shift absolutely move in the direction of it being a forthright, purposeful activity that could take 3 to 5 years, should take 3 to 5 years, particularly when you start thinking about, grooming individuals internally in the organization, which has been happening at J&J and other companies, but with the opportunity that we want to create succession and potential other opportunities for them. As part of that process, and why it does take so long to answer your question, is that there is an effort that has to go on underway to determine what is the ideal profile of that CEO. And the board has to be very involved in that process, as well as potentially other stakeholders inside or outside of the organization to determine that, because it is easy to kind of rely, particularly if you've had a very successful CEO in the seat, to say, I want somebody just like that. Or to say, today's environment warrants somebody like this. And we all know that the environment is changing so significantly that they have to go through a pretty thoughtful exercise to uncover and then to very much define what that perfect CEO will look like towards the future, whatever that time frame might be. And then to what we have also learned, which is very interesting, that I'd encourage all of you to kind of play a part of if you're involved in these conversations, is that, if I say that the perfect CEO must be highly strategic, or transformative is a big word that's in the boardroom right now, or have a high degree of innovation, that if you asked all of us here, let alone a broader boardroom, what those words mean, we will all say different things. So it is such an important game of semantics and definition, and then a little bit of going back to judgment. And how do you know it? Asking the questions, in a variety of different ways to try to understand what people are talking about, whether it be in terms of the board defining that role specification, if you will, or the candidate's approach, the individual's approach to how do they innovate, how are they strategic, how do they use judgment. You just kind of coming at that in a multitude of ways, which I'll go back to kind of a little bit of my opening statement, which is why it does take usually 3 to 5 years. And if you think about every time you pick up the paper or see a news article, when the CEO when there's a transition that's occurring, there oftentimes is not somebody that is ready to take that position. And then they have to start that exercise with the board at that point in time.
So to piggyback a little bit on what Mindy's saying, is we really experienced that directly recently as, having those conversations around what does innovative look like? what does strategic look like? And the board was not aligned. So one of the first things that we really had to do in our CEO succession was align the board to make sure that they fully agreed on what we were developing internally and what the future looked like. The board was not all aligned. We can't assume that the board is always going to be aligned on what the future looks like and what each one of these competencies or traits within a candidate really look like in action.
And if the board isn't aligned, when a candidate does come into interview for that position, the candidate will sniff that out in a nanosecond.
Right.
And the whole entire thing will go down the drain at that point, because what the boards typically don't realize is that they're being interviewed as much as the potential CEO successor is.
Yeah, one of the good things to do, and I'll ask Karen because I know she's had some experience in this as well, is just to work with the board on kind of scenario planning. If all of a sudden, we start to become more acquisitive, if all of a sudden we have to go through a downturn, what are some of the things that we would look for? That dialogue really becomes really helpful in terms of being able to make as you're saying, the criteria real, and you do start to get the board to start thinking around a line set of criteria.
Yeah, in my experience too, you have to remember a board is a team, but it isn't a team that works together very much. So they actually, many times don't know each other that well. They use words that mean different things. And I found my role as a CHRO in this process became actually the facilitator of the conversation. We had a criteria, and then the minute we saw candidates, it was like, well, I like Karen. It's like, well, wait a minute, what happened to the criteria? I liked Karen too, but, and trying to get a group of very senior people to have a bit of a structured conversation was one of the more difficult parts of it. And I needed to partner with 2 board members so they could help me facilitate the conversation, because it does take really pulling that thread. Well, why did you say, Karen is good at, what did you see? And but you're challenging, the board is not used to challenging each other or being challenged as a board. And so it wasn't part of the process that I thought I was going to have to really lean into, but as I got into it, it was probably the more important role that I played as kind of the process owner.
Yeah, that's great. Fred, I know you got probably some research from some of the programs that you run.
Well, just to build on what has already been said, going back to this volatile, uncertain, confusing, I'd add turbulent and complex organization or environment that we're in, the question is, have they been tested?
Yeah.
Because they will be tested again. And so it's easy to demonstrate good judgment when things are going well. Mm-hmm. It's harder to demonstrate, and more important, to demonstrate great judgment when things are going badly. And so we have a target-rich environment in which to identify people who've been tested. And I'd say that's a primary criteria. When we see CEOs that succeed, they've been tested in other situations and can be successful in a situation because they will be tested again. Mm-hmm. With average tenure of a CEO, 3.5 years right now. I remember one of my mentors was David Campbell when I worked at CCL years ago. And, we started the Colorado campus together. We had a little office on Tejon Street. And Campbell said, it takes 7 years to become a good CEO. And I said, wow, 7 years? And he said, yeah. The first 2 years, you've got no idea what you're doing. You're learning where the bathrooms are and so forth. And then the next couple of years, you're learning about the people. And by the time you're in the role about 5 years, you're starting to really learn how to do this. And at 6 and 7, you're preparing for the next person. I think CEOs also need the capability to get over themselves because they will be fired. They just comes with the job because the board will decide it's time, we're going to have that talk, and so they have to hold that loosely and figure out how to add the most value to the organization in that short period of time where they hold the reins.
Yeah. Well, and really, in this environment with activists and private equity, 7 years to get up to speed is probably not going to be something that people are going to have the tolerance for.
No
so
way.
The development planning that goes in, and also the criteria, having that solid criteria set, makes it so important so that you do get that higher hit rate. One of the things that, as you look at the literature, you listen to boards talk about succession planning within the board, there's always a lot of interest in figuring out internal versus external candidates, and managing the dynamics of that. When you're doing both external and internal, is an interesting set of challenges here. So I'm going to start with Mindy just to kind of.
Well, and I'm going to actually turn it to the audience for a second. By just show of hands, how many of you think that an internal is involved in the search for a new CEO the vast majority of time? Might have been confusing. When a CEO search is going on in the organization, how many of you think that there is more often than not an internal candidate for the role?
You bet.
Available or would
Be considered.
Considered.
Most.
So the vast majority of time, there is an internal candidate.
Almost always.
Almost always. Now, the preference is for internal candidates to be treated in the exact same way that an external candidate would be. So it is absolutely critical that they go through the process with the utmost respect and the full out assessment, regardless of any known observations about the internal individual. Now, having said that, when there is an internal candidate, the advice that we traditionally give to the board is that you don't put internals forward just because you want to have an internal. They have to view this individual as a viable candidate, because otherwise it does become very visible within the organization. And the one exception to treating them exactly like the external candidate is that you do want to be respectful of that visibility internally inside the organization. And you want to have the process go through in such a way that if there is a viable internal, but they are not selected, that they come out of the experience in a way that they still feel valued, appreciated, and that there is no discomfort for them to integrate back into the organization in a meaningful way.
I have found that easier said than done.
Yeah,
I agree. I agree 1,000% in what Mindy said. And in my experience, the more transparent we were with the internal candidates, the better, because they can see what's going on, they can sense what's going on, and the trust you build up by being open and honest with the with the internal candidate that there are external candidates. I also think the discussion I found at the board, when you're comparing an internal and external, often got to where do we think the company's going and which one of them is going to take us where we need to go. Mm-hmm. So I found us bouncing back to the criteria and the strategy, because each one of them brought different things and different strengths, and which one, it wasn't which was right or wrong, but which is the one we need right now for the company's strategic future. And so trying to get the conversation to go that way, I think helped us contrast internal and external.
Situational and thinking down the board.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
And coming back to those scenario plans that you had done, so as you were developing these internal candidates, you were developing them around these various scenarios and leading that conversation back to that point of where the business is at today and where we think it's going in the next 5 to 10 years. And is this criteria, how do we evaluate this criteria, this candidate based on this select criteria?
It's interesting. Somebody raised it earlier regarding staying in touch with your alumni. Mm-hmm. The current CEO of McDonald's is a rehire. He left. He was the head of Europe. He left to go private equity. And when we had kind of a tough patch, we've actually enticed him to come back in. And he was our insurance policy if the CEO didn't work out. He ended up getting the job. He's now the CEO. But this notion of you've got somebody who now has got this private equity piece. He understands the culture of McDonald's. His startup was like unbelievable. And I just encourage you to also think about, we call them boomerang hires, as a way, staying in touch with your alumni who are high potentials. They could be really strong leaders down the road for you. So.
And I was thinking about your comment about the disappointed internal candidate who doesn't get the job.
Yeah.
If they're being considered for the job, they are extraordinarily valuable to the organization. And if not selected, you can lose them on the one hand, and often do. And secondly, if they stay, they can cause a lot of trouble unless you prepare them to be a value-adding contributor when they're not selected. So treating them with dignity by virtue of the fact they may come back as a boomerang hire, you want to be on best terms with those folks.
Absolutely. I think there was a question coming up.
Yeah, I had a question.
Sure. Yeah.
So when you think about external to internal, promotion versus hiring, one of the biases that exist both positively and negatively, I think, is the fact that for the internal person, you know much more about them. So there's a positive to that and a negative associated with that too, right? Because when you're hiring from outside, you're only getting to see what they're prepared to show you in the short windows that you have available. Right. So how do boards, and how do you think about kind of coaching boards to tell them how to balance that effectively, so at the end of the day, the right choice is made?
It's an excellent point. Did everybody hear it?
I'm sure in the back.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Well, I can try to.
Yeah,
you have a
no,
better
no,
voice,
go for it.
probably.
Yeah.
I don't have a great voice. The question was, internals and externals. The good news and bad news is that an internal, you know what you have, and that could be a good thing, and it could be a negative. Honestly, it could be a disadvantage for the internal. And for the external, you really don't know fully what you have, according to Karen. And so how do you balance that, and how do you kind of work with the board? And I'm sure we all have comments here on how you do that effectively. But it is a true statement. The internal candidate has a reputation. They have great things. That's why they're being considered. But there could be unconscious or conscious bias against the internal. With the external, you have to do everything you can to bring multiple perspectives to the table about that external. What I always find fascinating is how quickly people, both the candidate and the board or the CEO, can make decisions about a particular individual for the job by going through fairly limited conversations, relatively speaking. So we encourage the board to actually engage in multiple discussions, doing things like even dinners with their spouse or significant others, as much interaction as you can have. And then in addition to that, doing the assessment that we talked about, doing some scenario planning, engaging in a strategy session even will be held. And then of course feedback, whether it's solicited formal feedback or informal feedback. Because again, you're trying to get as much data to the table as you can in those situations. Because there's always surprises, right? You're never going to know. There's no such thing as a perfect candidate, number one. And that is because as human beings, we're all imperfect. So when you have that dimension kind of working as your platform, you have to do everything you can to really uncover as much as you can so you don't have surprises springing up about individuals. And then the organization then goes another further step of doing much more deep background checks legally on fraud, on drugs, on a whole variety of things.
I wanted to add something to this and ask you to comment. So, first of all, are you encouraging boards more to look at social media and text and the history of what's available that this person has said and what's said about them, one. And how often do you encounter situations where you try before you buy? That you bring the person in a different role, they have a chance to be chief operating officer or some other role, president before CEO, and it's contingent upon a period of time in which they have the chance to demonstrate their capability.
So I'll try to take them in order. The social media question is, you know, I have to do as much as I can on social media because I inevitably will have a board director doing it, him or herself. So I can't be blindsided by that. But having said that, we do get into some very interesting conversations about, oh, I just followed Mindy's Twitter feed, and I was astounded by some of the things that I saw. And we're going through now a whole series of conversations that we haven't had before around how do you interpret that, how do you manage that, how do you determine if it's good, bad, indifferent, how much value should I put on it, that whole bit. I think that's a state of evolution.
Yep.
In terms of kind of trial running the candidate before they step into the CEO role, it's an interesting idea in theory. In practicality, very rarely will a CEO be open to that. They just want to be hired for the CEO position.
Right.
And it
You won't
creates
get-
tension
you won't
with
get
the
You typically
existing-
won't get
Get
the
the
A
top
talent
pick.
person to
Right.
jump in and say, hey, I
Right.
want to do that, you know.
Right.
So I think that's the, yes.
Maybe a couple of follow-ups.
Just on that last point, in one CEO succession that I was involved with, we did do an assessment that was quite intensive, and it was, you know, the role of a CEO, and it was over multiple time frames, and really did vet out. So they weren't really in it per se, but the assessment itself was so well done, and it really did highlight some strengths, but also some gaps. But just as a follow-up, so the bias on internal versus external, both ways, but if you do a meaningfully, you know, long process and you do identify some development roles that someone should go in, and sometimes they're, hey, you know, it'd be great for you to rotate and run HR or pick you know, which boggles my mind that we think someone could come in at some level and have all the background. But the nature of a development role is so you learn, and so you make mistakes and you grow. But then you're being judged on, you know, the stakes are really high, but you're going into a role, and so I just the risk and the reward in your experience on that.
That's
Yeah.
right, Kairey?
Yeah, I think the reward is bigger than the risk, because I think what you're looking for, and your comment was interesting, a line leader going in to run HR. We'll just pick that one for example. If they try to run HR as a subject matter expert, then that says that they're not the leader I thought they were, right? If they go in and think, okay, how can I help this team of HR professionals take it to the next level? You know, that situational leadership, you will learn a lot about someone and how they perform in a new and uncharted situation for them. So I think I tend to evaluate a leader in that role differently than I would, did they get all the functional things done, much more around how did they approach it, how did they up the game of the full team. So I personally think it's very much worth the risk.
I agree. Yeah, look at Mary Barra, you know, at GM. She did the stint. She was the head of HR. Former CEO at Xerox was, you know, did a stint in human resources as well. So I think, again, back to the cross-functional, you're testing somebody's ability to be able to kind of figure things out, and how adaptive they are to their different environments. Yeah, guys, I'm going to do a little bit because I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for the last segment, but I do want to touch on, because it's come up a number of times regarding how to build a deeper and diverse pipeline for CEO candidates, particularly women. I think, Fred, you said 20%. I think if you looked at just Fortune 500, that would be on the high side.
Right.
And there's some really great research that's been done by Jane Stevenson at Korn Ferry, where she actually interviewed and assessed 57 women CEOs. And a few of the findings were really kind of, okay, wow, that's number one. Almost all of them said they didn't aspire to become CEO. So this whole socialization issue of women not believing that they can become CEO. Those that did become CEO, they had an advocate talk to them and say, you know, you really ought to think about becoming CEO because you have the capability. So they got nudged, they got supported, they got, arm around them saying, hey, listen, think about this particular career path. When Korn Ferry assessed the women, they were off the charts. They were in the top 1 or 5% of characteristics of successful CEOs. So they had to be even stronger than the average male CEO to become CEO, which then says, boy, if you just encouraged the upper quartile of women within your organization, your pipeline for strong leaders would be so much more robust than what it is today. And finally, you have to test them and put them in, just because of the importance of it, you have to put them in P&L positions at some point within their career. So the report is up, stairs when you registered, but it's a great piece of work. She's now going to be looking at this in the area of ethnicity as well, and I think the research is really compelling right now, and hopefully organizations and boards will start to think differently about how they build those pipelines and get way past this so ridiculously low number of women CEOs. So just wanted to get that out there. So,
Great.
Fred, you want to take over?
We have 10 minutes remaining, and we want to move to the issue of development, how we grow and develop talent, especially for the top. What works, what doesn't. And that starts with transitions of the person who's in a role now and they're moving to another role at the top where the stakes are high, and what we know about those transitions. I loved Rebecca's comments. I've known her for 20 years. We were on a board together at Chief Learning Officer magazine 20 years ago. Isn't she great? I mean, sense of humor, but also so incisive and such a fine mind. I just think she's terrific. But 20 years ago, I wrote an article that was entitled "How Do Leaders Learn to Lead?" And at that time, I suggested that an emerging and really important way that they would learn to lead was through coaching. That, again, back to what I said before, I've offered courses all my life. I think they're great, but it's not the primary way that leaders learn to lead. They may pick up important information and useful. So we feel that about everything we do at Kellogg, and I think we do it as well as anyone in the world does it. But we know that it's about experience, and it's about you, the coach. And one of the critical things that you do is help people make transition, because it's a fragile time in their life. And so I want to turn to this issue of transition and ask the team, Vicki, if you don't mind starting, what really works in terms of helping a person make an effective transition in your experience?
So we have a lot of transition going on in our organization today, from the CEO level to the chairman of the board level, all the way through SVPs in our various business units. And the things that we've tried to do is engage them in the strategy discussions immediately. So, for example, in our CEO transition, we held off our business unit strategies for 3 months until we had the new CEO starting, and then having him go around, because it does a couple of things. He can go out and read the strategies, that's not the issue, but it allows him to engage with the teams that are presenting the strategies, provide them feedback, because that gives the teams the understanding of what his point of view is going to be going forward. And then afterwards, have regular feedback sessions with the CEO from multiple levels, from our incoming chairman, from the current chairman, from the CHRO point of view, from the CFO point of view. So giving those multiple feedback notions, and then engaging coaching as well to help ensure that his vision and message is getting out to the organization afterwards. So there's trying to align the organization on the change going forward and where the organization is going to go in the next 5 years.
That's great. that multiple perspective and surrounded by a team giving feedback. My observation is we talk about feedback as the breakfast of champions, but most people seem to be starving. They're going without breakfast, and going to work underfed. So I'm just building on that. What works in terms of creating a feedback-rich environment?
You know, in my experience, especially when a new senior leader comes in, that team generally sits back and waits for the leader to like show the way, you know, and this poor new person, you know, everybody is staring and sitting quietly. In one of my roles as a CHRO, I actually went around in a new leader situation and assigned everyone on the team, and I told the new leader, this is the role I want you to play for this person. I want you to watch how they communicate. I want to watch how, you know, how the follow-ups go, so that it actually you assigned people to draw them in and provide feedback. We had that conversation with a new CFO, and I tried it, and it actually seemed to bring the team much more quickly, but in support, in more visible support of the leader. I was watching this, somebody else was watching that. And then in the beginning, it's like, well, I don't know that they want that feedback, you know? And it was like, yeah, I know they may not want it, but don't they need it? And isn't it our job to give them that? So it sounded, in the beginning, it sounded a little crazy, but it actually then spread. People started giving each other feedback. Could you watch me? And so it opened up something. Now, probably only 2/3 of the people I tapped to do it actually did it, because only some are comfortable doing it. But it gave people permission and accountability.
That's great.
To support the transition.
Development as a team sport.
Yeah.
I like it.
Exactly.
Right.
Rich?
Yeah, I often would say you have to avoid the exhale factor when you put people into key jobs, which means, okay, now the person's in the job, we're done. I think it's only half the job, and providing a strong onboarding program for that person. What we would tend to do at McDonald's, we bring a small group together when we'd have a senior leader take on a new job, and it would be, you know, general counsel, head of communications, IR, CFO, myself. We'd actually put together a draft, 3 to 6 month plan, and have that person then take a look at it and make sure that they then, once they put their input into it, they reviewed it with their boss, in this case with the CEO, with the non-exec chairman, make sure there's alignment on the first 3 to 6 months. The second thing is encourage that person after a reasonable period of time, maybe it's 9 months, to do a 360 and get some real-time feedback from multiple stakeholders on how you're doing. And there might be 1 or 2 things in there that will let you know maybe you need to go down maybe a little different path on something.
That's great. When I became the president of Motorola University, there'd been one other president of the university. It was the largest corporate university in the world at the time. We had 1,800 faculty and staff and a $330 million budget. And we operated in 60 countries around the world. And my job became to take it from that to 20 people and $10 million. It was the hardest job I ever did, and excruciating. But one of the things that when we were in that retrench, and you know, Motorola was the finest technology company in the world at the time. But Motorola's history looks like a sine wave. You know, it looks like ups and downs throughout, and sadly, most recently, it's been a down in terms of the history of that, because I have such respect for the history. You know, in the museum that was on the campus, I had the phone that Armstrong said, one small step for mankind. You know, this was his phone. You know, and so I had the first automobile radio in the museum. And so to watch the down, it was really hard. After going on to Fidelity, where I was Senior Vice President of Leadership and Learning, there I was responsible for succession as well. And so I want to turn to you, Vicki, as we go to this last question, and then we want you to close it out for us with any comments or questions. You know, when I was at Motorola, I was faced with this issue of we've always done this inside. And so as we were closing Motorola University down, I looked to the outside and I looked to Kellogg. You know, I asked them to partner, and so we ended up using them as a partner as we sold off, and I sold several facilities as a part of that change. And we got out of the brick and mortar business in the university and into partnering with others who had brilliant faculty like Eric and John and others who are in the audience, and Colette and remarkable people. And we gained an appetite for external, bringing incredible organizations like ECC in to offer coaching. So that was a strategy, but there's a tension because the externals aren't us and don't have the same degree. So internal, external, internal, external. How do you think about developing leaders in your organization?
So we think about it from a balanced approach because there is some value of having the internal leaders teach other developing leaders processes or strategies because there's a cultural component, and we have a very specific. Every organization has a unique culture. But it helps to continue that culture if you're building it internally. If you're only building it internally and only doing development and succession internally without any external influence, it's just like anything else. You get too insular. It's like recruiting only from your industry. It's like only building one pillar within your organization. So having the external thoughts and external leaders partnering with universities that are thought leaders on particular topics. For example, digital transformation is a significant issue in our business.
Right.
We don't have leaders inside the organization to be able to teach what a digital strategy is first and foremost, or even understand it. So we have to go to the outside to bring that expertise in, to build those leaders, to build that competency and that skill set within the organization. So I think there's a risk if you only do it one way, and if you're only doing it externally, you really lose that cultural component, even if the university or the partner that you're aligned with is a very good cultural partner. You still lose a little bit of that. So I'm a big fan, and we've really built in that dual dynamic of doing a both and as opposed to an either or.
Terrific. Any comment, Rich? Perspective?
No, I give the audience a little bit of an opportunity.
Please.
Yeah.
I would think that it's just as important, maybe even more so, to have the feedback, the coaching, the onboarding for internal hires as much as external hires. And I think we have a tendency to sometimes do a better job of onboarding with external hires than internal, and especially for internal, because you don't want that person to just be acting the same way that they were in their old job. They have a new job now, so the game's changed a little bit, and just want your thoughts on that.
I'll take that one.
Yep.
I think the hardest transition is when you were a member of the team and you become the team leader.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Because all the people that sit next to you, now you're at the head of the
Yeah.
table. And I find that is the biggest risk
Hard.
transition because they still want to be, they don't want to feel like they're pulling rank, but at the same time, they're the leader and they need a lot of help. I think they need the most amount of help in navigating that change.
100%. It's a good comment.
Other questions or comments before we close it out? John?
The panel, how do you deal with the inherent tension between a CEO and chairman who may be hypothetically narcissistic, a bit Machiavellian, and has stacked the board, and then has to deal with case candidates in his succession pool who he knows will never be ready? How do you deal with that particular situation?
So just to repeat the question, I'll condense it a bit. The question was, when you have a CEO that has, my word, insecurity, and tries to surround themselves with people that won't outshine them because they're not really eager to place candidates in the pipeline that might replace them sooner than they desire. Is that close? Okay. And so the question is, what do you do to stop that mechanism? How can you help break it? And I'd refer to the board, first of all, as primary responsibility. And I think, Karen, you said it's 80% or maybe 80% of their job is thinking about that CEO succession and thinking about the way the CEO is surrounding herself or himself with talent and who they place. So it's a primary board responsibility to watch that dynamic and to hold them accountable. Would you add?
Yeah, I would just add, this is where, your job as a CHRO, fiduciary responsibility. You've got to be an honest broker. You've got to be able to go to your boss and say, I don't agree with the lineup. I think these individuals are not strong enough. And if you get asked, which you might, by the chairman and other members of the board about your point of view, I would be very candid about how you see it. And if the CEO says, well, you're not playing by my rules and you're not part of my team, then I'd probably feel good about finding something else.
Yeah. And I know you would. I know you would. Yeah, I think that courage, that character is what we look for in people at the top of an organization. And if they have the unwillingness to tell the king queen, what she or he needs to hear, then as opposed to what they'd like to hear, you got the wrong person in the job. Any other comments before we close out? Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you could comment about unconscious bias, especially as it relates to ethnic and cultural diversity.
Yes. I can comment. I have it.
and how that is addressed within C-suite succession planning and so forth. For example, it's wonderful we're talking about gender diversity and women CEOs being promoted, and that's great.
Right.
We need that. It seems like the pendulum has swung very strongly in that regard. I have a client who's a senior leader in a company. He's very talented. He's turned around an ailing division. He's a really excellent leader. But he senses that there's a lot of unconscious bias that's preventing him from moving on. And it's such a discouragement, he wonders whether or not he should move on. So to a different organization that's recruited him, tried to recruit him because they think he could be a really great role model for others. So how do you address that? What are strategies to make sure that that's addressed within the C-suite?
You want
to try it, Karen?
Karen?
Wow. Right. I don't know that I have a perfect answer in that case. I would encourage that individual to have that conversation with someone in the organization because they trust, because I think there are times where you see people through a certain lens. And I know as a up-and-coming woman, a working mom, there were times where I would have to say, you go to the baseball game, I'm going to go to the baseball game, I feel like you're judging me. And, then I'd go home and think, maybe I just shot myself in the foot. But there is, I think, a way to stand up for what you're feeling and doing it with the right intent behind it to start that conversation going. It may not be the individual raising it, maybe you can raise it, but somehow that's got to get out in the open so that it can be examined and discussed and the light of day, because it can't be addressed unless somehow it sees the light of day. Though as I'm talking out loud, I know how hard it is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I have this little acronym of acknowledge. So when we teach about this, and we try to teach the senior executives about it all the time, acknowledgement that we all have this is the beginning point. That it's not those guys that have this, it's all of us have this. And it goes way beyond just male-female. It's unbiased conscious in a multiplicity of domains where we hold this. And so recognizing it or acknowledging it is the first step, and realizing it and helping people to, and then second is challenging that with something that's more rational, that makes sense for our time. I mean, we can think back 20 years ago what would pass for a conversation in a boardroom or at this, it would be outrageously unacceptable, and is outrageously unacceptable today. And so challenging, encouraging people, the model of the people at the top in terms of their courage to challenge it. And then stepping into practices, deliberate practices that are different for the time and more respectful of all people. It's just that circle, and running that circle over and over and over. we want to bring this to a close. You are great. You've been great, and what a great panel. I want to turn it back over to Kathy, but just to say to Vicki and Mindy and Karen and Rich how great it's been to be on this panel with you, and how much fun this is, and how much I admire you and all of you. So thank you.